This is the 1986 Brabham BMW BT55, also known as the most powerful F1 car to ever hit the track. Close to 1,300 horsepower at peak output in qualifying and up to 1,100 horsepower in the race. Some say cars of this era of Formula 1 are to this day still the most challenging machines the drivers ever had to master. Today we're gonna put that claim to the test, seeing how these cars came to be, before taking a ride back to the 1986 season and its turbo monsters. Last time out we saw how F1 started to organize itself to become a professional entity representing the pinnacle of motorsport. Shortly after that 1975 season, Bernie Ecclestone became Chief Executive Officer of the Foca to further expand the business behind Formula 1. The power dynamic was shifting away from the FIA, and not everyone was happy about it. A political game emerged between two entities to decide who would have its say about F1 regulations and, more importantly, monetary gains. In the end, it was decided Foca, and thus Bernie, would rule over the commercial side of F1, with the FIA receiving its cut, while the FIA would design the rulebooks and ensure teams reasonable time to adapt to changes in regulations. These agreements are known as the Concord Agreements, and it's still the way Formula 1 is ruled to this day. In the meantime, away from politics, engineers were hard at work implementing some of the largest evolutions we've seen in F1 history. Ground effect was a key factor in privateers remaining competitive despite running 10-year-old engines. This aerodynamical revolution came and went, however, as it was banned in 1983 for being too dangerous. Turbochargers evolved around the same period. This technical element uses exhaust gases to compress the air coming into the engine to increase the combustion's efficiency. This made it possible for teams to reach outrageous amounts of power output. The compression would need to be closely monitored in the race, however, as the sustained forces the turbo inflicted on the engine would cause a lot of wear on the engine block. So, while at peak output, 5.5 bars of pressure have been recorded in qualifying on some cars, to reach the finish line, teams limited the engines to more modest figures. Renault initially introduced the turbocharged engine in 1978. At first, reliability was a big issue and naturally aspirated engines still prevailed, but in 1982 the last NA engine would win the championship. Turbo engines, although efficient at creating power, had flaws. The major one being the delay in power output known as turbo lag. The car would accelerate using at first only the NA engine's power, but then the turbo would kick in with torque creeping up suddenly, making it difficult for drivers to anticipate when the power would hit. These engines were also quite heavy. This needed to be counteracted by teams building cars as light as they could. The introduction by McLaren in 1981 of the carbon fiber monocoque definitely helped in that aspect. The technological race we saw in the 80s was impressive, and so were the drivers. Drivers partaking in the 1986 season that we're about to check out include some of the most iconic names in the sport, all racing in legendary paint schemes. Senna in the gold and black Lotus, Prost and Rosberg in that red and white McLaren, the blue, white and yellow Williams driven by none other than Nelson Piquet and Nigel Mansell. Berger drove the Benetton that was in its first year as an official team in Formula 1. And do I even need to mention Alboreto and Johansson in the Ferrari? These are just a few examples of the colors and characters you'd see roaming around on the track. Circus-wise, Formula 1 gradually distanced itself from facilities built to race on country roads to race more and more at permanent circuits, all in an effort to increase safety in the sport. In the 80s, however, cars would go back to race on public roads, this time in the middle of cities. 1981 Caesars Palace being prime example. Long Beach was also already an early example in the 70s, but that track was taken over from IndyCar and American endurance racing as opposed to being made for F1 specifically. Oftentimes criticized, street tracks were an attempt, just like today's street tracks, to promote F1 to new audiences. And that is what brings us today, to the streets of Detroit, to experience Formula 1 in the mid-80s.
Here we are then, we are on the grid, we have the mustache going on, we have the full grid of this 1986 Detroit Grand Prix, and we are go for this United States Grand Prix. A lot of smoke being kicked up, a lot of wheel spin, of course, what you would expect with the amount of torque that these cars produce. I'm gonna try and be a little bit more careful in this race, as there's already an engine blown up here behind us. Let's talk about the limitations and kind of the quirkiness of this sim for a little bit. I'm in Rfactor2 here for a 4-lap race with these cars to try and get an idea of what it would have been like. But there are definitely limitations and differences to what would have been done in real life. For one, the AI is driving with a very low amount of difficulty, so they are a little bit slow in the corners, just so I can kind of keep up with them on the straights. So in real life, just keep in mind that normally they would have gone a little bit faster in the corners, and the amount of downforce and error that these cars have definitely allow it. So normally we would have had a little bit of a higher pace around this track. But another interesting feature is that in the straights we're definitely going a lot faster than what they did in real life as well, because in the sim you don't have to be bothered by the fact that high amounts of pressures would destroy your engine. So we're essentially rolling with a full boost here today, and it's definitely a handful to drive this car with the full 1300 horsepower. These cars normally in race trim are not the most powerful cars to have been raced in Formula 1, because they would be tuned down. I hope you got that from the intro, because I went over it very quickly. But in this configuration that we're running today, they really are, and it's a handful. But we'll talk about the car more in detail a little bit later. For now, let's talk about this track that I'm sure is new to some of you guys, and maybe even most of you guys. If you're not a massive history nerd, or you've actually watched these races back in the day, then I'm sure you've probably never heard of this track, because it's not run by any other series than Formula 1, and it doesn't exist anymore on the Formula 1 calendar for some time now. So you won't find this in many games, and it's great to have it in Rfactor2. It's a track that I've really learned to love as I trained for this race. It reminds me in many ways of Singapore, because it's also quite a long track. It's about 2 minutes, a little bit less than 2 minutes for one lap around here. You have loads of flowing corners, not too many 90-degree corners, and you even have a little bit of elevation change, which is crazy to see on a city track. You don't see that a lot, apart from maybe Monaco. That's the one example I can think about right now. So how the race was in real life was definitely a little bit of a boring one. I watched a lot of these races to try and inform myself, because I feel like my knowledge of the 80s Formula 1 cars is not great, and it's not something that is shown often in the media, these 80s Formula 1 cars. So I watched a lot of races, and most of the races were races of attrition, with a lot of mechanical failures and retirements because of mechanical problems. But here in Detroit it was even more of a problem, with oftentimes drivers themselves making mistakes and such. So definitely a little bit of a slow burner, with people often staying in trains like this for most of the early parts of the race, and overtakes coming into play at the end of the race, which was definitely interesting. The overtakes that did happen were always very interesting to see, and very satisfying, because they were daring moves. But apart from that, quite a boring race, if we're entirely honest. Now let's talk more about the cars, because that's what you're here for today. The 80s cars, the turbo cars, as we got a lunch from our teammate trying to go for the inside here. I'm having to be extremely careful not to spin out by applying the turbo. And these cars, they are a real pain to drive, if I'm honest, but I'm going to develop that in the coming laps. As I was doing my research, I saw an interview from Martin Brundle that he actually raced in these 1986 cars. So it's interesting to have his opinion for sure. Nowadays he's most well known for commentating F1 races on the British media, but back in the day he was quite a capable driver. And he's raced a lot of different eras of Formula 1 cars over the years, test them out and to make pieces of media about them. So he's quite a reliable source when it comes to judging how difficult these cars were and kind of pitting them against other eras of cars. He personally said that these cars were probably the most difficult cars that any Formula 1 driver ever has had to drive. And I tend to believe him. It's definitely not as physical to drive it in a sim, of course, but even then I'm having to keep a lot of my concentration going on just driving these cars, and I'm going at quite a slow pace. I do realize that, but even then it takes all of my concentration just to keep this car going forward. Essentially these cars, they feel like you're being stabbed anytime you press the accelerator just a little bit too much, as I'm gonna go for a daring move around the outside here. Oh, and it just about worked. that was probably the highlight of the video there for you guys. A daring move that would probably never have happened in real life, and we might even get re-overtaken right after. No, we aren't. Okay, that's great. Oh, that was definitely a bit of a tough moment for me. But these cars, you have to actually drive them completely differently from a naturally aspirated car, which makes learning this technique and getting used to it to race competitively just even more difficult. You have to apply the throttle digressively, so essentially just like you would normally apply your brakes. And that's for the reason that the turbo is actually spooling up while you're initially pressing the throttle. That's where the turbo lag is coming from. And so you want it to spool up as quickly as possible, so initially you press the throttle quite harshly, and then you digressively apply the throttle, hoping that you won't get stabbed by that massive turbo power. And interestingly enough, going to second gear out of the corners is not gonna save you. The best way to drive these cars is to always, or quite often, go to first gear to have that initial input of the NA engine and then quickly go through the gears. And that's what they would do as well. They would go very quickly through the gear to avoid getting that massive amount of torque spinning them around. It really feels like getting stabbed in the rear of the car, and there's not much you can do about it unless just removing your foot from the gas a little bit, but you can't remove it completely because otherwise your car is just gonna spin around. So it's very, very difficult to deal with this, and you have to be very careful not to apply the throttle too much. And you would see the real life drivers often getting it wrong as well. The main technique I normally use to race these cars is by listening to the turbo and trying to know when the revs are gonna hit. But while commentating this video, it's definitely not the easiest thing to do as we come through the finish line for the end of this race. And it's been a very tough thing. It was only 4 laps, but man, that felt like a lifetime almost. And I can't even imagine what it must have been like to race these in real life with the amount of torque that they really had. Even in race trim, I tried to race these cars with a little bit less torque as well, a little bit less boost pressure, and still it just felt like you were getting stabbed anytime you pressed that accelerator too aggressively. But anyway, I hope you guys learned something today. I hope that wasn't too much information for you guys to absorb. I think it's so incredibly interesting to hear about these stories. If you are interested in more Formula 1 stories and other eras of racing, subscribe to the channel and leave a like behind. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you space racers in the next one. Goodbye.